The United States fought World War II on two fronts. There was the War for Europe and the War in the Pacific. The War for Europe was really about helping our buddies out. The War in the Pacific, on the other hand, really meant something to the United States. So how exactly did that war play out? Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today's topic is the War in the Pacific. Specifically, we're going to try to answer the question, what were the major events of the War in the Pacific? So grab your pencil and paper, get ready to take some notes. Hopefully by the end of this video you'll have an answer for this question. To kick off with, let's do a quick recap of how we got to World War II to begin with. Remember that it really all started with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. One of the best, sneakiest sneak attacks of all time, probably. Remember that happened on December 7th, 1941. Japanese came in, basically took out our Pacific fleet. But for the Japanese, things really didn't stop after December 7th, 1941. Very quickly, the next day, on December 8th, 1941, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines were a U.S. territory, and they're also pretty darn close to Japan. We had a pretty large military force in the Philippines. I mean, that was kind of the point of having that territory. And on December 8th, the Japanese began an invasion of the Philippines. They wanted the United States out of Asia. The military commander of the Philippines was a guy named General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur has a pretty interesting story. For a while, he and his troops put up a pretty good fight, but they were more or less just overwhelmed. As the Japanese kind of closed in on MacArthur's main base, he was forced to make this pretty daring escape in the middle of the night under the cover of darkness on March 11th, 1942. Famously, as he was leaving the Philippines, he declared to everybody around him that, "I shall return." As he made his escape, he promised the Filipinos that he would be back and he would basically take care of the situation. And it turns out he was pretty good for his word. Not long after General MacArthur had to make his daring escape in March of 1942, the Japanese pretty much took over the entirety of the Philippines. On April 9th, 1942, there's an incident or an event known as the Bataan Death March. The Japanese forced all the prisoners of war they had taken while basically taking over the Philippines to march on this 60-mile march to a prison camp through the middle of the jungle in the Philippines. Now, most of these prisoners were injured or sick or had been starving. They were not in the best shape, let alone ready to march 60 miles through a tropical jungle. The Japanese did not treat these prisoners of war very nicely. On this death march, which was a 2-day march, think about that, 60 miles in 2 days. That's hard to do even if you're healthy. They started out with approximately 78,000 prisoners, American servicemen, as well as Filipinos that were loyal to America. By the time the march ended 2 days later, the number was down to 60,000. 18,000 people died on this march to the prison camp. When they reached the prison camp, things only got worse from there. The next major event we have to look at happened also in April of 1942, specifically April 18th, 1942. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the military minds of America got together and said, we have to do something to strike back at Japan. We can't let them just sucker punch us like that without returning the favor. A plan was hatched by a guy named Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, or Jimmy Doolittle as he was known by most of his men and his friends. Doolittle was known in the aviation world for doing some pretty crazy things. He hatched this plan to put some B-25 bombers on an aircraft carrier, specifically an aircraft carrier named the USS Hornet. Then they were going to run that aircraft carrier as close to the Japanese main islands as they could get, launch these big giant bombers, and go and bomb Japan. it seemed only fair they came and bombed us. To a lot of people, this sounded like an absolutely crazy plan. To James Doolittle, it sounded like the perfect plan. And somehow, defying physics, they were able to figure out a way to get loaded bombers to take off from the USS Hornet. The attack was successful. Several military targets in and around the Japanese main islands were hit. The most important part of this raid was that it boosted U.S. morale. We were pretty dumbstruck by the fact that the Japanese were allowed to sneak attack us. But once we were able to return the favor, Americans knew that there was a good possibility they're going to win this war. A few weeks after the Doolittle Raid, there's another major battle called the Battle of the Coral Sea. This happens between May 4th and May 8th of 1942. There are a few interesting things about the Battle of Coral Sea. One of the first notable ones is this was the first Navy battle that isn't actually fought with ships. It was the first naval battle fought almost entirely with aircraft. To set the stage for you real fast, what was happening, the Japanese were making a play for Northeast Australia. There's a huge Allied stronghold in Australia. The Australians were part of the British Empire. And the Japanese said, well, we probably should go take care of them so they don't cause us any problems. So they sent a big majority of their naval fleet down to an area known as the Coral Sea. I'll stick a map up here real quick so you know exactly where I'm talking about. Luckily, by May 4th, the United States had been able to kind of revive its Navy, and the British had a pretty good chunk of naval forces down in Australia as well. The Allied combined forces, the Australian Navy and the U.S. Navy, were able to stop the Japanese. Up to this point, the Japanese had basically looked invincible. They really hadn't lost yet. But with the Battle of Coral Sea, it was very clear that the Japanese were not unstoppable. They could be stopped. Almost exactly a month later, the U.S. Navy has a brilliant stroke of luck. They spot the Japanese fleet not too far away from a place called Midway Island. Just so you know where we're talking about, again, here's a map. Between June 4th and June 7th of 1942, we have a thing called the Battle of Midway. The United States spotted the Japanese fleet. Fortunately, the Japanese fleet didn't spot the U.S. Navy. This gave us a great advantage. We were able to get the jump on them. Because of that, we sank 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers and did just countless damage to the remaining ships. Essentially, in that battle, the U.S. Navy was able to cripple the Japanese Navy so bad there was no possible way they could recover from it. Basically, Japan just simply didn't have the resources to rebuild its navy. So if you've been paying attention to the timeline up to this point, it's not been all that long from when we start with the attack on Pearl Harbor until we take out the Japanese Navy. Really just a matter of a little over a year. Once the Japanese Navy is out of the way, the Allies start slowly regaining territory. They start a thing known as the island hopping campaign. This really starts in August of 1942 with a group of islands known as the Solomon Islands. Again, just so we know what we're talking about, here's the map real fast. The Solomons were a great first target, mostly because of their closeness to Australia. It wasn't that far. We were able to get enough supplies there to really make the fight worth it. On August 7th, 1941, the Allies land on a tiny little island known as Guadalcanal. The battle for Guadalcanal was a serious battle. The Japanese knew that if they couldn't hold their ground, things would be bad. That's just what they did. They put everything they had into trying to maintain control of that island. By February of 1942, the Allies had solid control of Guadalcanal. It really marked the first major land loss the Japanese had dealt with. For the United States, this was a huge victory. For Japan, it really showed some serious issues. Most soldiers, when asked about the battle for Guadalcanal, simply described what they had witnessed and what they had been involved in simply as pure hell. Once the Solomons were solidly under Allied control, it really just became a matter of time. And to be honest, the Allies weren't necessarily in a huge rush to take care of the Japanese. Remember, from the get-go, we determined that Hitler was the biggest threat. We needed to take care of him in Europe first. Slowly over the next couple years, we worked our way up the Pacific Islands until we got pretty close to Japan. Eventually we got to some islands that were originally Japan's islands. These were part of Japan proper. The first one we went after was an island called Iwo Jima. And again, here's the map. Iwo Jima is a really tiny little island, but it's really strategic. It's close enough to be a base for Allied bombers to maintain bombing on the Japanese main islands. The Japanese knew that Iwo Jima was important, and they more or less put everything they had into defending it. On this tiny island, when we showed up, there were 20,700 Japanese defenders. By the time the battle was over in March 26th of 1945, there were only 200 Japanese survivors. The Japanese lost over 20,000 people. To contrast that, the United States lost roughly about 6,000. The next month in April, in fact April 1st, we went after an island known as Okinawa. Again, very strategically located, very close to the main islands. This battle was going to be a little more difficult. Okinawa had a more substantial Japanese population. It was a proper Japanese island. When we showed up to take Okinawa, everybody on the island, military, non-military, put up a fight. Over the next couple months, by the time it was all said and done, 110 Japanese had lost their lives trying to defend Okinawa. The Americans had lost roughly 7,600 people. The big lesson learned from taking Okinawa was what the Allies would have to face had an actual invasion of Japan proper been necessary. This left a really big question for the Allies to be answered, specifically by President Truman. How do we end this war without losing more American lives? Military estimates put the cost of invasion of around about 1 million American lives had we needed to go and actually invade the Japanese islands. There was a second option Truman could use. It was known as the weapon of last resort. You and I know them as atomic bombs. They were produced by a thing called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project had produced 3 atomic devices. One got tested. It was kind of meant to be a proof of concept, to prove that they actually worked. The second device was a device known as Little Boy. It was a uranium-based atomic bomb. It was determined that it would be used against targets in a city called Hiroshima. On August 6th, 1945, that first bomb, Little Boy, was dropped. When it exploded over Hiroshima, it instantly killed 70,000 people. And when I say instantly killed, I mean vaporized, gone, atoms spread to the wind. The after effects of that explosion, easily another 70,000 people died from injuries sustained, including radiation injuries. After that bomb was dropped, a message was sent. The Japanese said, "No, we're not going to surrender." It was determined a couple days later to drop the second bomb, which was known as Fat Man, a plutonium-based bomb, on targets in a city called Nagasaki. That happened on August 9th, 1945. When that bomb went off over Nagasaki, it instantly killed 40,000 people. And again, probably that many, if not more, died afterwards because of injuries sustained in that bombing. Now, if you remember, I said that the Manhattan Project produced 3 bombs. We tested one, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Now, if your math works out like mine, That means we've used up all the atomic bombs we had. President Truman sent another message to the Japanese and said, "If you don't surrender, we're going to keep doing this." I like to refer to it as the world's best bluff. Fortunately for everybody involved, the Japanese decided after Nagasaki that it was best to go ahead and surrender. Japan decided to surrender after that second atomic bomb. That announcement came on August 15th of 1945. That's become known as Victory over Japan Day, or simply VJ Day. Now, it would take a few weeks to actually get all the formalities worked out, but on August 15th, Japan surrendered. On September 2nd of 1945, the U.S. Navy sailed the biggest and baddest battleships, the USS Missouri, into Tokyo Bay. And on the deck of that battleship, General MacArthur, you remember that MacArthur that swore he would be back to the Philippines, accepted the Japanese total unconditional surrender. And with the signing of that document on September 2nd, World War II had officially come to a close. So what do we need to take away from this video? Number one, remember that the United States got some revenge for Pearl Harbor with the Doolittle Raid in 1942. Takeaway number two was, remember that the Battle of Midway really took the Japanese Navy out of the picture. And lastly, number three, remember that it was 2 atomic bombs that really brought World War II to a close. There you go, guys. The war in the Pacific. Hopefully you got good notes. Hopefully you'll be ready for when the quiz happens. As always, till next time, don't stop learning.